Okay. Adrian Webb, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview. And here we are on Zoom. So first of all, just a quick introduction. Who are you, and what's a little bit of background?
Who am I? So I would define myself by saying I'm a sort of one of those people that tries to bring a bit of philosophy and psychology into business. I've had 30 odd years in financial services, sort of leading marketing communications type roles, and that went very well. I got to work with some of the country's leading business leaders, Richard Branson, Sir Peter Wood, people like that. And then after that, I became a board director of Goco, who are one of the big brands in the UK. I became board director of a company that then went on to win the National Business Award for New Business of the Year. And now, at this moment, I'm still the longest serving board director at Goco, and I am chairman of a London marketing group and also chairman of a company that I started up to look at stress in the corporate world. So it's a mixed bag of things that excite my interest and make me think I can make a difference.
You sound perfectly qualified.
Thank you.
So just give us a bit further background. What were your early years like? How was school? What do you think your sort of primary interests and influences were at that time?
Well, I was often mocked by members of my family. So I have 7 brothers and sisters and a huge extended family. And I was often mocked for being the book learning boy of the family. So I would always be found reading. I spent probably the years of 13 to 18 constantly with my head in a book. I had a sort of thirst for knowledge that ended up with me going away to study philosophy and psychology, both of which I'm still passionate about to this day. So at school, you know, I was always taken with the new ideas, not necessarily the old ideas. I always wanted to understand the stuff that was underneath stuff. So I ended up sort of, you know, trying to read underneath what was going on, because I had this belief which persists to this day, that if you understand the theory underneath something, you can almost extrapolate out to anything. Whereas if you only understand it in one little isolated block, then you can't. And I love extrapolating. So yeah, that whole period of my life was good. And all those things have carried on to this day.
Fantastic. What stage do you feel that you got going in your career?
Well, I merged with a degree and had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. But in my first ever role, which was a sort of controversial one, that I was in the marketing and communications department of the City of Westminster during the time when the City of Westminster, basically the councillors were all prosecuted for gerrymandering. They sold off cemeteries to Colombian asset strippers. We had the Marchioness disaster. We had Legionnaires' disease outbreaks. So I was in a department sort of handling some extraordinary things in the history of London, with almost no qualifications, but found that I could sort of adapt fairly easily by watching other people around me and then entering situations with a degree of confidence. So maybe it is all a confidence trick to get me to here, but I felt that actually, having experienced some really, really odd things during that period of time, that I had some good experience and took that into the private sector, and seemed to be able to build good relationships with people above me, and to listen carefully to what it was they were really trying to achieve. And to me, one of the best mantras I've ever come across was taught to me by Sir Peter Wood, who's still my chairman at Goco and one of the country's leading business people. But he always said, you know, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that proportion. And I think actually, underneath leadership, great leaders that I've come across tend to be really good listeners and readers. They tend to be people who absorb information, lots of it, not just tiny bits of it and then blurt out their worldview, but listen and learn.
And who influenced you positively, particularly in those early years?
I think I had a couple of people who sort of led the show at the city of Westminster, who went on to do great things in the world. It was one of those sort of proving grounds. At one stage, we had the now departed lady who was the head of the Number 10 press office leading us there. So got enormous amount of experience from some of those people. But it was really less of the sort of technical skills and more of the people handling skills and the situation handling skills. And people often say about me that I don't tend to appear to panic at anything. And the truth is, I don't actually. I really don't. When faced with situations, I always believe there is a way through. And I was taught that by some of the early leaders who I still look up to this day. When I then jumped into the private sector, I was working for a man who was Britain's highest paid man of the 1990s. He was on the front page of the Sun because he was making too much money, because then he'd started Direct Line, and because of the intricacies of his contract at that time, he was receiving large amounts of money. I thought he earned every penny of it, because he was a really inspirational leader and continues to be to this day. Hence him getting a knighthood for his services to business. So those had an influence which I can't really calculate, because that was normal for me. 2 years with Richard Branson was very interesting. I got to sort of speak in his stead on many occasions. He always used to accept the offers of speaking, and then oftentimes would find that there was something more pressing, so he'd send somebody else. So I got to do a lot of that during my period with Virgin, and that was a fantastic period of time learning as well, because you just get to meet so many interesting people and absorb what you can of their skills.
Fantastic. What was your relationship like with your peers?
I think it's always been good. If there's one huge failing that I could address in myself, is that I'm probably not stern enough in always asserting what I think needs to be done. I'm always trying to find the third way that compromises and finds the best route for what two people want that might be different. And actually finding that third way is oftentimes a really great way of building trust with other people. And I've always said, on my gravestone, we've written the phrase, diplomacy is the art of letting other people have your way. And the key to that phrase is that to push somebody to do something they don't believe in, you will never get good results. They have to believe it themselves. And so influence is the psychology of persuasion. And persuasion is partly the understanding that people will not do things that you are forcing them to do, and will not believe in things that you're forcing them to believe. It has to come from within themselves. So relationships with my peers, I think throughout my entire career, have been good. There's still everybody I've ever worked with, I think I'm still in touch with somewhere. And so, that has not been a difficult thing, because it's working out how you're going to have your relationship with that person and how it's going to work best for both of you.
Fantastic. What motivated you to succeed? And what gets you out of bed in the morning now?
I think it's excitement at learning things. I literally, I say to my kids and my whole family, I try to make sure that I go to bed every day knowing more than I did yesterday. So what excites me is gaining knowledge and gaining insight into things and constantly probing. And, for a small philosophical detour, I'm a huge believer in the sort of scientific method. And the scientific method starts with the word ignoramus, we do not know. And so I start every project with, I do not know. And so, always, even if I've got a cherished belief, I'm looking for the thing that proves that cherished belief wrong, so I can get a better theory on how to do things. And that means you're in a never-ending quest. You never sit there and go, I know it now, and so I'm going to go plow ahead and do it. You wake up every morning going, I don't know it, and I'm looking for something to prove wrong the things I believe most dearly. And that's a good way to approach the world.
Definitely. I mean, philosophy to live by. it's an interesting divergence from a lot of leadership practice where there's a great deal of ego involved. How does your ego, we all have an ego, how does your ego sit with the practice of ignorance?
Pretty good, because I think, Google has taught us all that however much we think we know about any particular subject, there's people who know an awful lot more. So really, being good in business and your relationship with knowledge and with inquisitiveness is very much about trying to synthesize the useful and salient and proven parts of what you can read within the time you have available to you. And if you can synthesize that and then put it into action, and to get people to say, okay, here's an insight, what do we do with it? Well, we could do this with it. It may prove to be wrong, but if you're constantly trying to prove it to be right, you'll never succeed, because you will die before you can prove anything right. Every cherished belief we've ever had in science has been at some stage superseded by something else. We still don't have a grand unified theory, and neither do we have a grand unified theory of management. And I think if you have one set view of how to manage people or how to inspire people, then something like we're living through at the moment could change all that. You've got to be adaptable. You've got to start from the position of, I do not know what is best, but I'm going to go with what I think is best at this moment.
What gets you angry? What gets you shaking your fist at the TV or the news?
I think it's what gets me angry is more interactions where the person is not answering the question, and oftentimes it's that they do not even see the question. Not just they don't hear it, but they don't even see the question. And what I experience most is not anger, it's frustration. The frustration of not being able to get what's in my head through to somebody else is something I find overpowering at times. I have to walk away from it. It's the one thing that I find really hard to deal with.
Okay. What's your attitude and approach to leadership?
Very much, as I said before, this idea of diplomacy is the art of letting other people have your way, means that everybody needs to be aligned, and they need to be aligned behind this common set of goals and values, but probably to always question those as well. That is important. But to get the best from management, I've tried to boil it down, and I've thought about it a lot. And for me, my method is just two words. It's to inject possibility into people and organizations, to make them suddenly think, hang on, there's more we could do here. Hang on, there's more we could achieve here. Hang on, what if we did that? And to get them infused behind those possibilities that weren't previously necessarily visible to them, or which their roles, I can't stand it when somebody says, well, I can't do this because my role is just this. It's like, have a go. Let's see where it goes. Now, there's structure, there's this constant friction between control and structure and flow, which everybody's talking about at the moment. Can the two coexist? There's been doing a lot of reading about it. I think they can coexist, but it's within certain types of environment. And the idea of psychologically safe spaces where somebody can admit their mistakes and then learn from them, when somebody can say, I'm just not up to it today, and they can do something else. Those things, I know you and I share in common the view that vulnerability and the ability to be able to say, I really don't know, is hugely important, because it stops people wasting time, and it also stops them constructing a mask of themselves that is not their true selves. People spend a lot of their time in conflict that they do not recognize, because each of them is wearing a mask that's not their true self. So people will always hear me say, if I injected a truth serum, what would you say? Because that's what I really want to know. That's what I really want to know. If they think I'm doing something really badly, better to just say.
Well, I mean, and those are very legitimate
board.
questions. But of course, unless you've got that psychological safety, the answer you get is still the mask. How do you create an environment where people feel psychologically safe?
Well, there's a couple of simple things you can do, which is to extend the gap between stimulus and response. Most psychological vulnerability in the workplace comes from people who receive a stimulus that they don't like and respond rapidly in the way that that a monkey in the Amazon would thwack another monkey that's doing something it doesn't like. And it's as humans, we do have that ability to put the gap, the breath between something that we don't like that goes in through our ears, and to then mediate what comes out through our mouths. But part of that has to be what we were talking about earlier on, your view of yourself. Is your view of yourself that I know everything? Or, because my view of myself is that I really don't know, and I'm looking for better ways to learn. That if somebody tells me something that at first appears, I don't like what I hear, I don't like what goes in here, and I don't like what it does in here, then I try to give myself that 10 seconds to stop and have a proper think about it before I do anything. And usually I've trained myself to say, tell me more.
And that, I mean, that whole bit about receiving, particularly that bit about receiving bad news well as a leader, is incredibly important, because exactly as you say, that difference between reaction and response, when we react, we might well thwack someone over the head for some bad news and create an environment of psychological unsafety, which means they're never going to tell us bad news again, and therefore we don't get to hear about it.
I have to say, having spent 20 odd years working with Sir Peter Wood, of big business leaders, I've never ever met somebody who is so capable of hearing somebody saying they haven't done something well, or they've not done what they're meant to do, or they've missed something, or they've made a mistake, and responding positively to that. And I think I've learned a lot of this from him, because when somebody comes to him and says, I've made a huge mistake, his first thing will be, what have you learned? Will you ever make it again? And if the answer is, I've learned X, Y, Z, and as a result, I won't have to make that again, it's not a problem. I've done that with him, and I've gone into his office with a book down the back of my trousers. And literally he's basically said, stupid mistake, learn from it, don't make it again, but don't stop experimenting. And that view of not experimenting but not betting the ranch is a beautiful thing within the businesses that Peter has developed, and it's something which I've carried over into everything I do, which is to say to people, don't do a feasibility study, just try it, see what you learn. If it goes wrong, throw it away quickly. There's a million books in W.H. Smith about this sort of stuff, but it's really important because it is a hallmark of the type of leadership you have.
But it's really interesting, that point, though, that it's, yes, there are a million books about it, but this is an emotional, vulnerability-based thing. It's not a head thing. It's not about knowledge. It's about how you feel in the moment and how you're able to regulate those emotions in that moment.
Quite right. And in fact, one of the influences on my leadership has been trying to understand more about those systems that we use to process information. And anybody who's read up on Steve Peters or Daniel Kahneman or any of those people who look at the neuroscience underneath it know that all information basically goes into the sort of the lizard and monkey brain first, and they have a chew on it before it gets anywhere near the thinking part. But very often our reactions in those parts of the brains are gut instinct reactions, and we hit out. That's where the problem occurs. And self-control is really about the ability to be able to control those initial reactions and to allow the human side of you, the thinking part of you, the modern part of you, to mull it over properly, and then to mediate your reactions to things. The ability to, there is no control other than self-control, because all types of control ultimately come back to self-control. And if you don't have it, you don't really have any control.
What transformations have you achieved, either in your private life or work, and how do you think you did it?
I think in work, there's a couple of things. Most recently, with Lab, where I'm chairman, I've tried to inject into that organisation the ability to harness some of the intellectual strength to change their business model from a company that just does marketing for companies to a company that says, how could we take the same skills to society-based problems? And as a result of doing that, time and intellectual capital was invested in things which didn't bring money through the door. But in the process, we have built things that have caused much bigger entities to come through our door saying, how about you use these ideas in this space? And those spaces are often bigger spaces than the ones we were competing in before. So you're looking at sort of vulnerability and how vulnerability manifests itself digitally. Those ideas I help to sort of build up in that organization by injecting the art of the possible. Let's sit down and let's work out, if we had to solve this problem, how would we do it? Because it was some of these problems nobody else was solving. So I'm particularly proud of that. And I think it's the same view that I take everywhere, which is let's look for the bigger picture, because the bigger picture tends to be more valuable than just that sort of time and materials. You tell me to dig this hole and I'll dig this hole. It's sort of, why are we digging the hole? Why don't we try this instead?
Do we actually need a hole at all?
Is a good one. Do we actually need a hole at all? And people will often say about great experiences with companies is those companies who said to them, don't spend all the money on this because we don't think it'll work. You can probably do this without much money. Are the ones that actually end up with getting more money out of those organizations, because the sort of truth to power exists in organizations as well as with people. And you've got to take the big picture. So injecting a bit of possibility, injecting a bit of big picture is something I'm very proud of. Back in the insurance days, we did some extraordinary things by looking at what was possible in the world. Could you tell if somebody was lying by the way they were speaking over the telephone? Controversial, extremely controversial, but very, very interesting. And did some of that. And more recently in my business with sort of stress management, one of the things we realized very early on was that one of the biggest problems about stress management is that when people rate their own feelings, what they end up with is a picture of themselves that they don't necessarily want to see. And so people's answers to questions on sort of Likert scales, the -2 to +2, or the smiley face and the sad face, people's answers are often skewed. So there are very few examples of really good sort of objective self-monitoring. Because when the doctor says to you, how many units of alcohol do you drink a week, Mr. Crofts? And you say, 10 units, and they will double it and add a bit and add it on. And that's because we don't want to see ourselves in those ways. So one of the things we did with the stress business was sort of find new ways to solve this basic human problem of recording information about yourself without it being skewed. And we found a way to do it. And that's gained interest now from the aviation industry, from the medical industry, from the cardiology industry, from all sorts of places. And really, it was down to sort of looking for the big problem. I think that's the philosophical side of me. I always want to look for the problem under the problem.
What kind of collaborators and partners do you seek?
Very often they are people with really good analytical skills. I particularly, I always want for somebody to say, no, you're wrong, before I get too far down something. And that requires people with analytical skills. You have to appreciate that however much you react to somebody initially, very often the true them is only really knowable after probably 6 to 12 months of being with them. This is why recruitment is so difficult. So, I always try to squash any first impressions of somebody, because you never really know until you've interacted with them multiple times what that person is like. So, never make a judgment of the person who you think is too quiet or doesn't seem to be doing what you think they should be doing, because sometimes they might be doing something even more important. Sometimes their personality might not fit with you, but whose problem is that? Is it theirs or is it yours? You know, I tend to start with the view that it's mine and try to adapt, and that seems to work well.
Very good. When you're confronted with a problem, how do you think about it?
I unpack it. Every problem, I think, is usually a meta problem. There's a bigger problem somewhere underneath it that somebody hasn't identified. So I think this is sort of, you know, the training of spotting biases and fallacies and logical misconstructions in things. I'm a devotee of the human bias codex that tries to look at how our thinking is flawed, because it tends to have too many shortcuts built into it by the need to conserve calories when we were hunter-gatherers. But long story short, but you know, I always try to look at the problem beneath the problem. If you address the problem itself, you get one result. If you look at the problem beneath the problem, you have a chance of getting a much bigger, much more interesting result.
So not addressing symptoms, but looking for the underlying.
Quite right.
Mechanics.
If you're just paracetamol to every problem, then every time there's a problem, paracetamol is needed. What you should be looking is to take away the root causes of problems. And I think in business, that's particularly true. There are 1 million companies offering paracetamol to other companies in the terms of services. But what they should be doing is a root cause analysis why those problems just keep recurring.
Well, but because it's interesting, if you talk about it from a business services point of view, and there are many other ways of looking at that, but actually, you know, it's quite hard to persuade people that they actually want something more significant than paracetamol. Very often, people don't want, as you said earlier, they don't want to look at the deeper questions. They don't want, you know, that's too scary, and that goes for individuals as well as businesses.
Well, it's, you know, again, into the philosophy, if you look at the philosophies exposed, not exposed, I can't remember what the word is. Look at the philosophies espoused, that's the word, sorry, I knew it would come out somewhere. The philosophies espoused by Sartre, Camus, Kierkegaard, people like that. Basically, what they were always, all of those people were saying is that you can fall into bad faith. You can fall into just accepting things because it's too much effort not to accept them. But the argument is always, that's not the true you. You are basically giving away a huge part of your life on earth by just fitting in, by just parking your tent next to everybody's tent and saying, I'll do this for an easy life. Because the unexamined life isn't worth living, as Socrates said. And, you know, and I agree that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And so the easy option should not be the option. It's the options that make us uncomfortable that the ones I'm looking for, because discomfort, as any athlete will tell you, is the key to growth. Psychological discomfort can be also the key to greater resilience, greater ability to deal with things. And in business, discomfort is, you know, like the lobster that grows out of its shell and goes under the rock and comes out with a new shell. You know, it's the pain that triggers the lobster to shed the shell and grow. It's not comfort. When it's comfortable, it never goes under the rock and grows a new shell.
Which brings us back to vulnerability again.
Exactly.
What do you think is the role of leadership in the world today?
Cool. If you asked me that question in January, you'd probably get a different answer, because it is a lot of things have been turned on their head very recently. So, you know, you and I have probably spent time re-examining what the role of leadership is and what the role of leadership should be and what the outcomes of leadership should be. You know, it's very interesting contrasting the social commentary on someone like New Zealand's leader with America's leader. Looking at the way that somebody who appears to be free of so many of the failings that Mr. Trump, you know, wears on his sleeve as strengths, of how much they can achieve in terms of sort of national identity and pride and action. So I think the emergence of leaders who are authentic is going to have its day, and I think it will be more promoted by the vulnerability of the era that we now know we're living in.
Well, I think, today, which is the 21st of May 2020, the three countries with the largest reported number of case numbers of coronavirus are the US, Russia, and Brazil. All three led by populist, authoritarian leaders who have tried to downplay the risks of coronavirus. And by contrast, Jacinda Ardern was one of the first to bring her country, New Zealand, out of lockdown and start the road to recovery. So yes, I mean, it has shown the role of leadership in sharp relief. But there's a challenge here, isn't there? Which is, people have voted for these populist leaders, and I guess this goes back to one of the points that we talked about before, which is people don't understand leadership, because if they did, they would vote for people like Jacinda Ardern, not people like Jair Bolsonaro.
Absolutely. If you had perfect knowledge, if we had omniscience, authentic leaders would be the ones leading us.
This goes back to the point you made earlier, though, which is this point about the unexamined life. I mean, a lot of these people don't want to ask these difficult questions, which is why they vote for Trump, because he doesn't ask difficult questions. He makes it easy. Make America great again. That's all it's about.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to human biases, and we offered easy solutions, human beings will take them. It's just the way we are, because we have grown up over millions of years trying to conserve energy. A lot of what we do as human beings is all about the conservation of energy, because for many more millions of years than the time since we've had writing and money, conservation, gaining of calories and conservation of energy was really important. And you conserve energy by having heuristics, by having shortcuts that mean you don't sit there going, do I pursue the mammoth, or should I wait for tomorrow for the other mammoths to come by? You don't make those decisions. You have to act decisively and quickly. And very often, acting decisively and quickly in real world situations, in physical situations, can be the key to survival. The problem comes in political situations and in societal situations, that sort of just reacting quickly and positively with a sort of gung-ho attitude is really not the way to run a country. It's really not. We can all read about what happened with the Brexit vote. We can all read what happened with Trump's election. But, underneath it all, if certain easy solutions were not being presented to people, they might have had different views. And one of the big problems with the sort of the dumbing down of politics, the dumbing down of everything, is that the speed of communication flow in the modern world, particularly with social media, has led to a change in the way that our bodies release dopamine in response to easy answers and quick self-gratification and Amazon Prime and all those great things that deliver instant satisfaction. Because most of the world's problems are not going to be solved by very easy solutions. They're going to be pretty complex.
When people vote to make America great again, how many of them know that it's implausible when they? But it's the easy solution. It's the easy one in their psychology. Do they do it knowingly, implausibly, or do they genuinely believe it?
They genuinely believe it. I honestly, I think that when you have strong phrases just as you have a speaker, if somebody stands up at a Hollis conference and they have fantastic body language and the tone of their voice comes away, it almost doesn't matter what they say. They'll get better feedback than somebody who is giving dense, really interesting information, but cannot engage. And the same is true with words, is that words that are easy to grasp. One of the tricks I always play, and I encourage everybody to try this, is that one of the human biases is that something that sounds like a maxim is accepted by people more than something that doesn't sound like a maxim. So when people trot out a phrase that sounds like something your grandmother said, people will usually nod their heads. And my experiment with this is I always come out with something that's completely nonsensical. So the phrase I always use is, well, it's the silent word that's always heard. So if it sounds like a maxim, it sounds like it's received knowledge, because that's the way that knowledge was handed down for millions of years. It was handed down by word of mouth, by things that sounded epigrammatical, that were easy to grasp. And the same continues today. But the problem is, in the societies we live in today, simple solutions will not be good enough. We have to find complex solutions to complex problems that requires complex sets of interplay between various parties to solve them. And just make America great again. Who can be against it? Because as a phrase, it's undeniable. Not even you and I would say, no, we don't want America to be great again. People want America to be great again. It's the sort of economic engine of the world. So who can say no to make America great again? The problem is, how do you make America great again? That's where the divide comes, yeah. and it's a divide with many layers that you've got to pick apart.
Who are your leadership role models?
I think of all the people, this will be biased by the fact that I spent so much time with him, but I think Sir Peter Wood is an extraordinary role model for anybody who wants to see how a great leader can guide people by sitting in a room and listening to people talk for 2 hours, and with 20 words can lead people off the back of it, rather than him speaking for 2 hours and not taking things on board. So he is the greatest listener and reader I've ever come across in business. I think other great leaders, I think Jacinda Ardern, I think she will emerge as a great leader. I think, I've got huge admiration for her across the world. I think a lot of the typical sort of Jack Welch, Warren Buffett things, I don't really have particular time for. I think that very often there are sort of geographical and other things that have contributed their success. So what I would like to see really is sort of what I would call, authentic leadership in your definition of it. Real people with real views who are not afraid to be told that they're wrong and to learn. There's relatively few of them, because those don't tend to be the people that people have ordinarily responded positively to. There was always a story of John Harvey Jones arriving as chairman of ICI and saying he was getting rid of his Rolls Royce because he wanted the workers not see him as a man who drove a Rolls Royce. And on his first visit, somebody sort of went up to him and said, "Well, I'm leaving because I want to work for a company where the chairman drives a Rolls Royce." Which, it's all about aspiration. It's all about where you want to get to. And, the unfortunate thing in that situation is, if he'd had a Rolls Royce, that man had a Rolls Royce, I don't think it'd make his life any happier. But for us as people working for businesses, what usually will make us happier, and what makes me happy when I return home, is that I think I've done some proper thinking. I've been vulnerable in front of people I work with and admire. And I've learned something that hopefully will make me a better person tomorrow when I go back to the office and try again to tackle some of the problems we face. And I want to see that sort of same vulnerability in all of our leaders, and that same authenticity. And I think the authenticity is a product of the vulnerability.
We tend to think that leadership and vulnerability are almost the same thing in many situations. At what stage do you think one becomes a leader?
Well, in simple terms, one becomes a leader when one leads. When you know that people are following you because they believe in what you are doing, then you are leading. If you're in a situation of sort of conflict with people beneath you, but you manage to herd them so that they produce what you want, you're not leading really. Everybody has to feel part of it. You know, one of the things that Marx really didn't like about capitalism was the fact that everybody became a tiny, insignificant cog and lost sight of what life was all about. I think to really succeed in business, you have to make everybody feel like a much bigger cog, that they can see what part they are playing has in the bigger picture. And so a lot of that is about communication as well. It's ensuring that people share, share the views of management and understand the same things. It's not an us and them. We will understand this, but we'll tell them that. Those days are leaving us rapidly, because we all have the ability to go away and test what we're told.
I love that distinction between leader and herder. That's very nice. I haven't heard that before.
Well, it has to be the case. You have to, if you are just herding people, you are basically subjecting people to your will. They stop being people, really. They if they are people, you value various things about them. Now, getting some people aligned, in the way that iron filings align when you put a magnet underneath them, is that nobody's forcing the iron filing to point a particular way. It's just the strength of the magnet allows them to become very aligned in what they're doing. For me, that magnet is a magnet of sort of vision, of authenticity, and of that person realizing that probably the best result for my life is going to be to give my best in the situation. And I'm going to get more possibilities as a result of it. The old model of, you work for this many years and eventually I'm going to give you the responsibility to actually hit the horseshoe rather than just put the bellows on the forge. I think those days are gone, because people, particularly younger people these days, are on fast acceleration, driven by that instant gratification. They don't see the boundaries anymore that probably are still in place in cultures like Japan. In terms of you've got to do your 10 years before you can progress to here. Inspirational leadership is very important. And what's an inspiring leader? With somebody who aligns people by putting a very strong magnet underneath them.
So yes, if you herd people, all you get is sheep. If you lead people, then you get discretionary effort.
Exactly. Expressed much better than I did there.
I was trying to do a maxim.
There you go. You did it well. You just got to make it rhyme, and then people will believe you. No problem at all.
Final question: are you a leader?
It's a really hard thing to say about yourself. It really is, because when you do that, you tend to find the things that you say I'm not, rather than the things that you say I am. Because a bit like the description of somebody as Mr. Crofts is something that I can only give to you. In polite society and in debrettes, you can never call yourself Mr. unless you're a surgeon or a subaltern, actually. And in the same way, I think the same should be true of leader. And also, I have a big thing about this, but I think the same should be true of entrepreneur as well. I don't think anybody should describe themselves as an entrepreneur. I think that's always for other people to attribute it to you rather than you to attribute it to yourself. So,
well, that's interesting. So I think there's I'm going to challenge that a little bit, actually, because if you talk about genius, for example, I completely agree with you. Genius is something to be described as rather than to describe oneself. But leadership is, I get the psychology of what you're saying. I think people generally find it very difficult to describe themselves as leaders, or I think that's true. And if you ask people in a room, if in a room of leaders, and you say, put your hand up if you think you're a leader, very few people put their hands up, if any. So I totally agree with that. Having said that, I think the reality of leadership is that leadership is a choice. And it's a choice that you make in that moment when you see something that needs to change, when you see that opportunity, and you inspire people to follow, you are making the choice to lead. So I both agree with you, because I think we do find it very difficult to say I'm a leader, or what I'm doing now is leading, or that. And yet on the other hand, it is that active leadership that makes us a leader. So maybe you're right. Maybe it's when people notice us, when people choose to follow, they are conferring leadership upon us. But I think there's another, conversely, leadership is not an appointment. So it's not for someone senior to say, okay, you're leading now. It's still whether people follow, because it is only in having followers that one becomes a leader.
The words "making you a leader in this business" should never be spoken, ever, by anybody, because it doesn't happen. Leadership is an emergent property from a huge set of skills, of worldviews that are inside somebody. I've often said to people, if you look at the sort of history of great leaders, there are some things that well, now I'm going to rephrase that. There are some things that they all have to have, but none of them ever has to have all of them.
No, it's true.
Some people can be, excuse the French, utter bastards, but they can be incredible visionaries. Anybody who's read the Steve Jobs book, and incredible visionaries can lead businesses extraordinarily well. Some people have almost no vision, but are just fantastic at managing people and getting great things out of people and inspiring those people. And I've worked with people like that before. And so you've got to tick one of a number of boxes. But I think the communication ability that we now all have with each other, and the ability to use our search skills on Google to test the leadership statements of others and the authenticity of others. Politicians being hung out to dry all the time because they do say one thing and do another. The reason is because we all have the search capability to test the authenticity of those who lead us. And in those times, you either try to live a life where you put on this elaborate Wizard of Oz show to the world, but behind it you try to keep your secret life of incompetence away from everything else, or you just accept you've just got to be authentic to be a good leader. And I'm in the second camp. I'd rather nobody called me a leader and I felt authentic within myself than everybody called me a leader and I was like the Wizard of Oz with two sticks with gloves on the end and a big purple blanket.
Fine words to end the interview. Adrian, thank you so much for that. Really
great pleasure.
Valuable.
Thank you, Neil.